Thank you. And I'm honored to speak alongside so many leaders in their respective fields and to be able to present some ideas here in Israel at this particular time. It's most meaningful for me to be here in Israel right now. I'd like to begin by providing some context on the most recent rise in anti-Semitism in America and American higher education, and then I'll talk about the work that we're doing at Brandeis University to help address this reality. Over the past decade, we have seen on many American campuses a marked increase in anti-Semitism, mirroring what was happening in American society at large. The rise, often attributed to the emergence of Donald Trump as a major voice in American politics, came predominantly from the political right, or at least the focus of attention was primarily on the right. Trump's common use of the tropes and memes, often exaggerated and outlandish, went well beyond the norms of common public discourse and set new standards of what others would say and do in public. A good example of that was the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in August 2017, where white supremacists marched and chanted, "Jews will not replace us." This slogan is rooted in the white supremacist belief that non-whites, controlled by Jews or Jews themselves, will eventually dilute the white population and eventually replace it. A number of other far-right incidences of Jew hatred followed Charlottesville. Incidents of anti-Semitism from the left were hardly absent during this period, even before Charlottesville, but they were more subtle. They were what we might call passive Jew hatred, which became far more explicit following October 7th, as prior to the Hamas attack, many incidents were largely cloaked by using Israel as an effective surrogate target. The best example was the rise in popularity of the Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctioned, or BDS, movement on campuses across the U.S. and within professional academic associations. Though BDS was founded in 2005, its roots are traced to the NGO Forum at the 2001 World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, the same gathering at which Israel was declared an apartheid state. BDS resolutions began in earnest in 2009, though calls to divest from companies that profit from the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza began as early as 2002. The divisive debates on campuses served an important purpose, and that was to foster anti-Israel and sometimes anti-Semitic sentiment among students, faculty, and alumni. That is, the goal was, and often remains, less about succeeding in achieving divestment and more about keeping the discussion on the front burner to shine a bright and negative light on Israel for more and more to see. Fast forward to October 7th, and what had in the past been seen as one-off and muted anti-Semitic incidents, largely viewed as limited to the Academy's extreme progressive circles, was now unmasked and normalized. The protests, which erupted right after the Hamas attack, were extremely effective in vilifying Israel and, by association, Jews who identified as supporting Israel, and eventually any Jews, whether or not they claimed to be Zionists. These protests post-October 7th garnered broad support very quickly, and far more quickly than the far right's often vile and sometimes violent public displays of anti-Semitism. As of May, more than 80 pro-Palestinian encampments had been set up at American colleges and universities. At more than 70 of these schools, violence and arrests occurred. As of June 6th, more than 3,000 students had been arrested nationwide. The Anti-Defamation League reported that anti-Semitic incidents on U.S. college campuses spiked by a staggering 321% this year, most of which occurred after the October 7th terrorist attacks. The causes for the remarkable popularity of what are generously but largely inaccurately billed as pro-Palestinian demonstrations would require an entire conference to discern and try to understand. Much has been written about the influence of Marx, Fanon, Freire, and Said on the ideological foundations that have shaped an intellectual movement that has dominated the humanities and humanistic social sciences over the past 40 to 45 years. The result is an easy-to-digest but overly simplistic oppressor versus oppressed, neo-Marxist, and intersectional paradigm that now shapes so many syllabi in American university courses. Critics lament how too many courses in these disciplines have become less about teaching students how to think and more about indoctrination. History based on facts, the engagement in real debate, and looking for nuance in studying the human condition seem no longer to be the core of higher education, all of which has fueled the uncritical and ignorant acceptance of new definitions of genocide and settler colonialism, and an inability to acknowledge the relationship between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. Unlike past protest movements that were focused on the Vietnam War, the Civil Rights Movement, or women's liberation, two things stand out from the activism of the past 8 months. First, the focus of the protest is on Israel, and by extension, for many of the protesters, Jews, rather than on the American government or segments of American society. And second, at virtually every university where these protests and encampments have seen intimidation, harassment, and physical altercations aimed at Jews and pro-Zionists, institutional codes of conduct have been largely ignored, trumped by the claim that such activism is a form of free speech and is protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. For those less familiar with free speech rights and the First Amendment in the U.S., this claim is a red herring. The First Amendment states, and I quote, "Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press or the right of the people peaceably to assemble." In what is a common misunderstanding, the First Amendment extends only to the government, insofar as protection from the prohibition of free speech is concerned. Private property owners, which includes many of the colleges and universities that had the most visible activism and encampments, are not limited in their actions by the First Amendment. And even public institutions, which are under the jurisdiction of and funded by their respective state governments, and therefore must abide by the First Amendment, are permitted to apply time, place, and manner restrictions on speech and all forms of free expression. One cannot, even according to the University of Chicago's gold standard of free speech principles, say whatever you want, whenever you want, and wherever you want to. Beyond these established limits to unfettered free speech, Title VI of the United States Civil Rights Act of 1964 places restrictions on the content and manner of one's speech. Title VI protects all students at all levels of education in the United States, including Jewish students, from discrimination based on race, color, and national origin, including language and actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics. Schools must take immediate and appropriate action to respond to complaints of discrimination, which includes harassment or bullying based on race, color, or national origin. Failure to comply can result in investigations and the loss of federal funding, which is significant to all major research universities. And so while freedom of speech is foundational to higher education, to the pursuit of new knowledge and truth, and is something that should be limited only in very narrow circumstances, some of the current wave of pro-Palestinian activism, or what often looks more like pro-Hamas activism, should not be protected by free speech principles or the law. Many of the protests have violated both the time, place, manner restrictions written into the university's Code of Conduct and Title VI of the Civil Rights Act, which is why today there are investigations of 64 colleges and universities brought by the Office of Civil Rights since October 7th, the overwhelming majority of them having to do with anti-Semitic incidents on campus. What is most puzzling, of course, has been the failure of many universities to intervene in the campus protests since October 7th, when they have been willing and even eager in the past to prosecute the most minor of verbal slights, sometimes with punishment of suspension for students and dismissal for offending faculty. The hypocrisy is undeniable, and it forces one to ask, why, when Jews are the target, are the judicial processes on campus less frequently engaged, and there is such a visible double standard? Though the hypocrisy or double standard has been ongoing for some time, the aftermath of October 7th and the protests against Israel make the connection undeniable. Jews have been treated differently on our campuses, with Israel and anti-Zionism together serving as a convenient camouflage for anti-Semitism. I should note that not all activism against the war in Gaza or against Israeli policy or the Israeli government is anti-Semitic or even anti-Zionist. There are individuals who do not deny Israel's right to exist as they protest for peace in the region or for the rights of Palestinians. Yet, many of this year's protests exhibit a kind of anti-Semitism that would not be tolerated if the same kind of activism was directed at any other minority group on college campuses. First, assuming that all Jews think alike, such as holding the same opinion of the conflict and therefore are fair targets of exclusion and harassment. And second, claiming that American Jews cannot distinguish between criticizing the Israeli government, as many Israelis do and have always done, and also supporting the right of the State of Israel to exist as the homeland for the Jewish people. And so what should and can be done to address the impact of the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism in the U.S. and on U.S. campuses? Clearly, no single institution, and even the efforts of the entire American Academy, can erase the scourge of anti-Semitism, the oldest form of collective hatred, which waxes and wanes and evolves with great effectiveness. But individual institutions like Brandeis and the American Academy at large can do things to more effectively address the current rise in Jew hatred on our campuses, and much of it doesn't take much beyond a willingness to exercise clarity and leadership and buck the political pressures exerted by the extreme segment of protesters. First and most obvious is the equal application of one's institution's code of conduct. This would require, of course, a rejection of the claim that freedom of speech, as critical as it is to higher education's core mission, has no limits, and so protecting the rights, the educational environment, and freedom of expression for all students is vital. Second, adhering to the Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which protects individuals, in this case students on our campuses, from speech and actions that intimidate, harass, or may incite physical violence. Some of you mostly are familiar with some of these chants that have been going on campus that sort of fit this bill. From the river to the sea, for Jews there is only one solution, and there is only one solution: Intifada, revolution. All of these cross the line where speech becomes gratuitous rather than free, and it does not advance the educational mission of a university. Third, review and reforms one's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. It is clear that some colleges and universities' DEI offices not only exclude Jews from their mission, but have also made them the scapegoats for deep divisions among campus constituencies. They have designated Jews as white, as privileged, and therefore linked to the plight of the less fortunate, ignoring both the diversity within the Jewish world and the long history of prejudice against Jews. Fourth, strengthen the institution's academic offerings in the history of Zionism and anti-Semitism, along with providing sophisticated analysis of Israeli society and culture, so that the history of the Jewish people is better understood and shared on campuses. This would include having sessions on anti-Semitism during new student orientation as part of explaining student rights and responsibilities when part of an academic community. Fifth, as pressure mounts to boycott companies that do business in Israel, institutions should invest time and resources to look more closely at the sources of funding that support the non-peaceful anti-Israeli protests. More specifically, university leaders should stem the flow of funding to organizations and shadow organizations that promote hatred toward Israel and, by extension, to Jews. And sixth, put limits on and even ban student organizations that engage in attacks on Jewish students just as quickly and frequently as administrators would act if any other student group were targets of such behavior. The dechartering of Students for Justice in Palestine, as Brandeis did in November, is a good example of rejecting hate aimed at Jews. These 6 to-dos will, of course, not eradicate anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism from American campuses, but collectively they will make a difference in the overall campus climate for Jews and all other students who are interested in getting an education. For Brandeis, the university founded 75 years ago, 5 months after the founding of the State of Israel, I should say, specifically in response to anti-Semitism and quotas on Jewish enrollment in leading American colleges and universities, there is, in my view, a responsibility to do more to address the rise of anti-Semitism. Though, as the university's founding president, Abram Sacher, underscored from the start, Brandeis was established as a secular institution, striving to become an institution of academic excellence more like Princeton and Swarthmore than Baylor, Fordham, or Yeshiva University, the latter 3 all religiously based. It can be both secular or remain true to its founding purpose and values nonetheless. It should also set an example for higher education in how an institution could ensure the same rights and protection for Jewish students as any other and all groups. We have introduced programs over the course of the last 2 years and initiatives that we hope will do just that. 2 years ago, we established a partnership with Robert Kraft and his Foundation to Combat Antisemitism, through which financial support from Mr. Kraft and other donors allowed us to develop a set of programs aimed at students, higher education leaders, and future professionals aspiring to lead Jewish organizations. Our initiative to combat anti-Semitism in higher education for campus leaders brings together deans of academic and student affairs, DEI campus leaders, deans of admissions, provosts, and presidents from institutions across the U.S. for workshops, 2-day conferences, and 4-day intensive institutes to help prepare academic leaders to shape discussions and programs related to the place of Jews on their campuses. It is clear from the first set of programs, all of which have been oversubscribed with waitlists, that knowledge of Jewish history, Judaism, Jewish peoplehood, diversity within the Jewish community, Israel, and the relationship between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism is very limited, even and especially among those responsible for ensuring a safe and rich educational environment for all their students, Jews included. The early success of this initiative's programming has brought requests from disparate groups across the country for us to adapt our program to their needs. These groups include local and regional Jewish federations, to national Jewish organizations, to Board of Trustees of universities and colleges, to leaders and teachers of K-12 schools. A second program, supported generously by our collaboration with the Kraft family, focused on Brandeis's master's degree program in Jewish professional leadership. This program, which has served those who wish to lead Jewish organizations in both the U.S. and abroad for 60 years, will expand its curriculum to include modules on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism and become available online to serve a much larger population and produce more and better prepared future Jewish leaders. A third program, focused on our undergraduate students, is an endowed program that provides funding to faculty to offer new courses that introduce students to anti-Semitism as the subject relates to their respective disciplines. Through these discipline-based courses, students who otherwise would have never studied anti-Semitism are engaged in courses in varied disciplines beyond Jewish studies. Courses so far have focused on anti-Semitism in theater, the persistence of anti-Semitism in France, taught in French, anti-Semitism in the plays of Shakespeare, the power of anti-Semitism in interwar Germany, and the intellectual history of anti-Semitism. Aside from the benefits to our students, these courses expand our faculty's knowledge of anti-Semitism. And judging by the positions taken by many faculties across the country, especially at our most elite universities, preparing new courses like these should serve to dampen extremism and ignorance of the subject. A fourth program is supporting research conducted on anti-Semitism by the Cohn Center for the Study of Modern Judaism. The Cohn Center has done numerous detailed studies of American Jewish communities over the past 4 decades and has begun recently in-depth studies of anti-Semitism on college and university campuses. The center's work is of great interest to the general American population and the American Jewish community, and it informs our work with higher ed leaders and K-12 leaders as well. Our other university research centers and institutes that focus on Jewish history, education, gender, and Israel studies play a major role in the programming of lectures, panels, and conferences, helping to explain the nuance and complexities of the Israel-Hamas conflict. And finally, and importantly, we seek greater collaborations with Israeli institutions of higher education in order to counter the growing boycott, divest, and sanctions movement that is picking up steam at many American universities and within professional academic associations. Our goal is to increase exchanges of faculty, postdocs, and doctoral students to help redefine on our campus the narrative about Israel, Israeli academics, and the conflict. We also want to provide American academics the opportunity to be in residence in Israel and expand their understanding of the country, its rich, diverse, and complex culture, and what it's like to live in this neighborhood. And to that end, we are committed to working closely with Fulbright Israel and any other organization that can help strengthen relations between the American and Israeli academies. In closing, I would say, because of the strong ties to the American Jewish community since its founding, along with our unambiguous statement about October 7th, on October 7th, our Jewish and Israeli students feel fully supported and free to pursue their studies and lives as their true selves on campus. We believe the steps I have outlined, even if only a few could be pursued and implemented, would go a long way to elevating the experiences of our Jewish students at other colleges and universities. Brandeis is committed, as never before, to working closely with Israeli institutions of higher education. We look forward to creating new collaborations with willing universities, businesses, and nonprofit organizations to help combat anti-Semitism and to bring Jews from North America into closer contact with Israel. I welcome your partnership to help change the landscape of higher education in the U.S. Thank you.